Okay. All right. It's about that time. Don't mean to cut people off, but we'll start working this way. Alrighty, as we get started this morning, do we have any prayer requests? No, you're good. You're good. Good morning. We'll both answer to it. It's fine. Yeah, a little bit.
I have 3 kids that look, girls that look like twins, but they were 2 years apart.
Yeah. All righty. Any prayer requests this morning?
Yeah, for my wife.
Oh, okay. She's sick, right? Is that what I heard?
She got through with these kids last night.
Oh, really? Really? Oh, heck. Right. June? Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Are the kiddos sick too?
Sir?
Are the kids sick too?
No.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
I don't know where it's pizza or what, but anyway.
That was at Papa John's, right? Can't trust him. No.
Try to get y'all to go with Sam.
Yeah, right. We should. All right, let's pray. Dear God, thank you so much for this day. Thank you so much for the opportunity to come here to be surrounded by other Christians, to study your word. We're very grateful for that, and grateful that we don't have to do it in dark corners or hiding from the government. We are very, very thankful for that freedom and pray that that continues so that we can continue to meet like this without fear of persecution. God, we want to pray for Tracy as she's dealing with the sickness and help her recover from that quickly. Hopefully it's nothing too bad. Just help her get back on her feet and give her comfort while she deals with that. And God, we want to pray for Miss June as she struggles with COVID, especially at her age. Help her, help the doctors around her. She is recovering, but we just pray that you continue that process and give her comfort in the meantime as she heals from that. God, as we approach your scripture today, help us to do it with the right mindset and the right attitude, with an open heart and open ears, God, to let your word change us and not for us to change it. It's in your son's name we pray. Amen. All right, we're continuing our study of Mark, and we're still in the first part of the book, those first 8 chapters or so, leading up to Peter's confession, which is the turning point of the book. And if you guys remember, the question that Mark is trying to answer in the first 8 chapters is, who is this man? Who is Jesus?
I remember what you wanted us to remember.
There you go. Good job, good job. Who is this man? Right? This guy shows up, he's performing miracles, he's teaching with authority, he's casting out demons, all these different things. The natural question is, who is this guy? And that's the same question we would have if somebody showed up today. So we're in that portion of the book, and Mark is continuing to give evidence to who Jesus is, proving who he is, slowly, little by little, and the evidence keeps building upon itself, and it keeps getting greater and greater. His miracles and the things he's doing keep getting greater and greater. And today, as we're studying, we're going to see now that the more influence Jesus gets, the more people start following him, the more people start attaching themselves to him, the more other people are getting upset with Jesus. They're mad. He's taking their followers and they're launching a series of attacks against Jesus. We barely started on this one last week, but if somebody could, will you read Mark chapter 2, verses 14 through 17? And we're going to finish this section where we left off last week. Mark chapter 2, verses 14 through 17.
And as he passed by, he saw Levi the son of Alphaeus sitting at the recent custom, and said unto him, Follow me. And he arose and followed him. And it came to pass that Jesus sat at meat in his house. Many publicans and sinners sat along together with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many, and they followed him. And when the scribes and Pharisees saw him eat with publicans and sinners, they said unto his disciples, How is it that he eateth and drinketh with publicans and sinners? When Jesus heard it, he said unto them, They are whole, have no need of physician, but that they are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners to repent.
Awesome, thank you. So if you guys remember the story just before this, what was the miracle that Jesus just performed right before this interaction? Yeah, the paralytic. What was their attack against Jesus in that encounter? Do you guys remember? Right, and what was their issue with him? Yeah, he forgave the sins, right? They said, you're guilty of blasphemy. That was kind of the first attack. And now we're getting to, and that one, remember, they didn't even verbalize. He heard that one in their hearts, right? So they're a little bit shyer. And as this goes, they get more verbal, right? So now they've reached the point, they have an issue with Jesus, but who do they talk to? Do they go to Jesus? Who did they speak to about it? To his disciples. Yeah, not to him, right? What should they have done? Hey, Jesus, why are you doing that? If they really had an issue, what are you doing? But they didn't want to. They said, okay, why is he doing that, right? And then you'll see later when they have an issue with his disciples, do they talk to his disciples? No. I'll talk to Jesus. Why are your disciples doing that, right? They have a problem with confrontation right now, right? And you'll see that throughout the book, is that they don't like Jesus. They don't like the things he's doing. But they're also, I don't know if it's that they're intimidated by him, and that you should be intimidated the way, every time they bring a test to him, he answers it in a way that they can't, possibly, answer back to. So there's a little bit of intimidation, I think, that they're scared of him, at least scared of him making them look silly when they attack him. So they're going kind of in a roundabout way. What is their attack here? What's their issue with him? Yeah, he's eating with tax collectors and sinners. We talked about tax collectors last week, right before we left, that they were kind of traitors. They're partnering with the enemy. They're partnering with Rome and all of those things. Who are the sinners? Who are they talking about when they say sinners and tax collectors? Who are the sinners here? Well, the Pharisees are the ones that are kind of mad about him. But yes, they are sinners. Right. These are people that at least the Pharisees and the scribes would have considered to be open sinners. Right? Right. Known deviants. It might be somebody whose job is sinful. It could be a prostitute. It could be someone like that. It could be somebody that's dealing with a sickness. And they've now said, oh, because of your sickness, we know you're a sinner. But these are people that they look at as sinners. Who determines who these sinners are? That's who does. Who determined who these sinners are? Yeah, right? We've just decided that you're a group of sinners. Are the Pharisees sinners too? Yeah. Did they think of it that way? No. They're sinners, right? Why is he eating with people like that? Which seems like a silly thing, because they're the people that Jesus says are in the most need. We see the word Pharisee a lot in the Gospels, and a lot in Mark. What is a Pharisee? Other than a troublemaker that likes to cause issues. Okay. A Pharisee is a separatist. They kind of viewed themselves as, really better than everyone else, but they're very concerned with not being like everyone else, right? They want to restore someone from the tribe of David, the lineage of David, back to the throne, not like the Herodians. And you remember the Sadducees, the difference between the Sadducees and the Pharisees is that the Sadducees didn't believe there was a resurrection and those things, which is why they were sad, you see, which is how I remembered as a kid. But the Pharisees are separatists. And you may know people like that are more concerned with not being like someone than they are with being like God. The Pharisees were very, very focused on not being like other people. I don't want to be like this group. I don't want to be like this group. Can you think of another group that's kind of like that just kind of cuts themselves off from the world? Like, I'm not going to be like them. I'm going to avoid all of these people that aren't like me. Right. What I think of is monks. Like, I'm just going to cut myself off. I'm going to go back into my monastery and I'm going to avoid everyone, right? And I'm not like these people. They're not to the same extent of monks in that they still live among the people, but you can see there's no interaction. I don't interact with you. Like, me and my group do our thing and we're different than you guys. And that's why they made so many different rules, too, to cause even more separation between them and normal people, right? And we have to be careful that we do that, too. That we're not trying to not be like someone, but that we're trying to be like Jesus. Because sometimes it's easy to say, especially at church, I don't want to be like this denomination, instead of I want to be like the Bible. Or I don't want to be like that group of people because that group of people's wrong, that we forget we just need to be like Jesus. And that's kind of the issue that the Pharisees have, is that they're very focused on separating themselves from other people. They're not as focused as they should be on making themselves close to God. Because they want to be different than everybody, because they want to be separate, they're always looking for arguments. They're always making judgments, right? And doing all of those things. And we know people like that today, where we're just looking for arguments and stuff. Is their issue that Jesus is eating and drinking? No. What is their issue? Who he's eating with, right? Who do they think he should be eating and drinking with? Them, right? The good people. Well, he should be eating and drinking with us. What does it seem like might be underneath this a little bit? Like an emotional issue they might be having. Jealousy, right? This guy comes, he's performing miracles and stuff. Why is he not talking to me? I'm better than those people. Shouldn't he have come straight to me? Why are you eating with them? And I don't think Jesus is saying in his response, you guys are healthy, you don't need a doctor. I think he's responding as if you're right? Like these people are all bad and you're just perfect. Shouldn't I be helping them, right? Is it not the sick? Because we know these Pharisees actually have very, very bad heart issues and they do need Jesus. But Jesus is going to the people that are even more receptive of that. They might have thought when the Messiah was coming that he was going to come and just hand out like attaboys and tell everybody, you're doing great, especially you Pharisees, you scribes, y'all are awesome. Everybody else needs to get their act together. But he wasn't doing that. Jesus came to heal. He came for sinners. And this is different from their view, right? Their view of sinners is, let's avoid them. They need to repent. I have no part in that. And God wants us to take an active part in people that are falling short, right? Like that's our responsibility too, to take care of them. They didn't view it that way. That's on you. Take care of it yourself. And Jesus is like, no, this is a burden that you share with these people. You go down there and you help them out. When Jesus said this, it's not the healthy who need a physician, but the sick. What should their response then have been? Jesus, I'm sick too, right? Like, you came for sinners, I'm a sinner, help me out. But that's not their response, right? Like, they don't care about that. They don't see themselves as the sick. They don't see themselves as the sinners. They don't see themselves as the problem, which is going to be their big problem later on. Who should we be focused on from this passage if we're going to be like Jesus? Right, absolutely. No, you're good. Right. Sometimes I think we spend too much time, like I'm guilty of it too. It's easier to hang out with Christians, because you're like on the same page. It's fun, like we all get along. We don't have to argue about dumb stuff and all of that. It's harder to go and reach out to people that disagree, right? It's harder to reach out to people who are the sick or the things like that. But they're the people that actually need it. And sometimes it can just be more comfortable to just say, I'm only going to hang out with these people and I'm only going to interact with these people. Well, these people are okay, right? The people that need help are the people that may be a little bit more difficult to interact with. So, is Jesus, this passage is sometimes used to justify hanging out with bad company, right? It's almost used as a contradiction to like what Paul said, bad company corrupts good morals. How do you balance this with that truth? Like Jesus said, I didn't come for the healthy but the sick. You have that truth. And then you also have bad company corrupts good morals. How are these not in contradiction to each other? Okay, what do you mean by that? Right, exactly what you're saying. Jesus' intention was not just to hang out and have a good time, right? That would have been a bad decision, right? Like to be surrounding himself with a bad crowd just to hang out, right? Jesus was on a mission, and he lived on a mission that he's trying to reach these people. So if you're hanging out with people, we need to be around the bad crowd, right? Because we want to save the bad crowd. But there's a difference between trying to reach them like Jesus did and just accepting their behavior and just hanging out, right? There's a big difference between those. And we have to be careful sometimes that we don't use like this passage to say, yeah, I can, bad company corrupts good morals. Yeah, but not me, right? Because I'm more like Jesus. I'm just trying. If you never talk to them about Jesus and you're never reaching, trying to share the gospel with them, you're not doing what Jesus did, right? You're just hanging out. So we have to be careful that we balance both of those the way Jesus did. So have you guys heard that passage kind of used that way too? Like, oh yeah, I can have all these friends. Jesus hang out with sinners and tax collectors. Well, yeah, for a reason, right? Okay. Can somebody read verses 18 through 20 for me? Just a short little reading. All right. So John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting. Which John are we talking about here? John the Baptist. Right. John the Baptist. So John's disciples and the Pharisees are fasting. And their issue is that Jesus' disciples are not fasting. Why did they expect them to be fasting? Yeah. There's an expectation that you do what we do, right? There's an expectation that you imitate us, right? Why did they have that expectation? Because we're so good, right? Why wouldn't you want to be like us? Really, though, was there anything in the old law that said you had to fast at this certain time? No. Was there anything that said you had to copy what other people were doing as far as tradition? No. This was a man-made rule that they had. This was something that was a tradition of theirs. Was there anything wrong with them fasting? No. There's no issue with that. Fasting is a good thing. It's a great thing that they could be doing. Their issue is that they're expecting Jesus to imitate them. They're expecting Jesus' disciples to imitate them. Who are we supposed to imitate? Jesus. When they saw Jesus, and it's like, you can do all these things, what should they have been doing? Oh, you're not fasting? All right, we're not going to fast right now. Why aren't we fasting, maybe? Just ask him, whatever you're doing, I'm going to do. And if you can't explain, that'd be great, because I want to know why. But they're instead saying, you need to fit into our box. You need to fit into our life. You need to do what we're doing, fit into all of those things, instead of us fitting into what you do. Okay, Jesus gives a response. They ask this question, and Jesus answers with a question, as he often does. They ask a question, he asks a question back, and typically they can never answer the question. And Jesus asks, while the bridegroom is with them, the attendants of the bridegroom cannot fast, can they? So the question is, would you fast at a wedding? No. Why wouldn't you fast at a wedding? Yeah, right. Somebody spent a bunch of money on food. What is a wedding like? If you had to describe what atmosphere that is, what is that? Celebration, right? Yeah, right. It's a time of celebration. It's a time of joy, right? You're just like, this is awesome, this thing's happening. If you were at your wedding and you're celebrating and all of that, and somebody's sitting in the corner and they're just like refusing to eat and everything, you'd be like, oh, are you not happy for me? Are you not enjoying what's happening right now? It would be inappropriate, right? It would seem weird. And that's the point that Jesus is making. So in his little question, or this little metaphor that he gives, who is the bridegroom? Jesus, right? Who are the attendants of the wedding? His disciples, right? The people that are following after him. Why then, following the wedding metaphor, should they not be fasting now? Right. And what is now the time for? Celebration. That's something that we miss. They've been waiting on the Messiah forever. The Messiah is finally here. The response should have been celebration. You see it briefly, like how Jesus' response right before he's crucified, when he's coming into the city, and they're all saying, Hosanna, you're my king. That's how it should have been his whole life. His whole life should have been everybody saying, our king is here. This is awesome. What can we learn? What can we do? But that's not the response. But he's saying, for these disciples that follow me, this is a time of celebration. This is a limited time. And then once I'm gone, they can go back to fasting, right? Then it would be an appropriate time to do that. But right now, it's not. Did the Pharisees and the religious elite consider it a time of rejoicing? Why not? What are they so bummed out about? Jealousy. He's not exactly telling them, you're doing great, right? Almost every interaction he has with the Pharisees and the scribes and the priests is negative for the most part. And Jesus is taking a lot of the tension that they had, rightfully so. You have the mentality of John the Baptist, who was very okay giving up his spotlight. He must increase, I must decrease, right? He was totally fine with that. They're not cool with that. They want their spotlight. They want their attention. So for them, their 15 minutes of fame kind of is ending, and they're very upset about it, right? So it's not a time of rejoicing for them. It could have been. It could have been a great time for them. They could have followed Jesus through everything, but instead they chose to be sad. And notice who they talked to. They had a problem with his disciples. They came up to him, why are your disciples not fasting? They go to Jesus instead of going to them. And then verses 21 through 22, it might be separate in the Bible, or in your text, he's talking about the same thing. Like he's just continuing to talk. And he says, no one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. Otherwise, the patch pulls away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear results. No one puts new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is lost, and the skins as well. But one puts new wine into fresh wineskins. And the implication, fresh wineskins can still stretch, right? What is Jesus talking about? Why on earth is he talking about this? Because it can seem random at first. Yeah. So he gives two examples. He says you don't mix, you don't attach new cloth with old garments, messes up both, and you don't put new wine into old wineskins. Old and new, right? Both of these concepts are explaining the same thing. You don't mix old with the new. Keep old with the old, keep new with the new, right? You don't mix them because it's bad for both. You'll ruin everything involved. If you do, you will ruin it. Why is he saying this? I think that's a big part of it. Jesus also in John calls himself the new wine, right? He's this new thing that's coming. He's not, at this point, coming to destroy the law, but fulfill it, right? But he's saying you can't mix this old stuff with the new stuff. What did they just try to do? Force him into a tradition, right? They're trying to fit him into their traditions, and they've been doing that for, why are you eating with people we don't eat with? Why aren't you fasting when we fast? And they're going to continue doing that. They're trying to fit Jesus into their old way of thinking and into their traditions. And Jesus is responding by saying, that's not going to work. That doesn't hold me. It's like trying to put new wine into an old wineskin. I don't fit into this box that you've created. These rules that you've made, these man-made rules and regulations and all those things, I don't fit inside of that, right? That's not something that's good. He's just saying that's not what he's building is new. They were guilty of wanting Jesus to look and act just like them, right? They didn't accept that he was bringing something new and better. Can we be guilty of doing the same thing that they're doing? Of trying to make Jesus look and fit like into our box? How do we do that?
There's a lot of nations that are guilty. They don't want to look at what Jesus is trying to explain. They want to explain something to Jesus.
Right.
I think it's I don't know if you call it a power play or
Right.
that's just my one way of looking at it.
Right. Right. I agree 100%.
Ways that we turn, from churches turn their worship into entertainment, fitting into what God laid out for
Right.
worship. There's 1,000 different ways that we
Right.
try to make him fit. We pick and choose the parts that we want to follow or to do, and even with evangelism, it's not comfortable to, like you were saying earlier, it's not comfortable to talk to people. So we think, okay, well, let's just pay someone, I'll give my money to somebody else who will go do it for me.
Right.
Actually, all of us are supposed to.
Right. I think a big thing is when you add extra restrictions or add extra qualifications, it's like you just need Jesus plus this, right? Like Christ plus this. It's one of my favorite things one of my teachers, Dan Owen, always said. He said it's not Christ plus, but we do that sometimes. You say, well, if you want to be, really pleasing to God, you have to, be a Christian, of course, but you also need to vote the same way I vote. You need to be in the same political party as me. And if you don't vote the way I vote, then you're not really, you're not really a good Christian. Otherwise, you would vote the way I vote, right? That's adding an extra qualification. Or, it's okay to be a Christian and everything, but if you don't come to Sunday morning and Sunday night, you're not as good of a Christian as I am, right? You're not as spiritual as I am. You're not fasting when I fast. And there are things that are good. There are things that are good things for us to do that, like fasting, for example, there's nothing wrong with it. But once you go and mandate that on someone, and you put that extra rule on someone, you're doing exactly what Jesus is fighting against here. Where you're adding a man-made rule, a man-made tradition to somebody that's not fair, right? And the problem is we don't have the authority to do that, right? We're not in the position to carry out those rules because no one's standing before us on Judgment Day, right? Christianity is hard enough, right? Christianity is difficult. There's aspects of it that are very easy, and it's great, and it's much better than the Old Covenant. But being a Christian is hard enough, especially in the world we live in. We don't have to make it harder by also making sure that everyone is the exact same kind of Christian as us. Make sure that they do all the same traditions that we do and follow all the same man-made rules that we do. And that was the Pharisees' problem. They weren't okay with people being different than them, even though that's okay. God is God of so many different people. And if you go down to Mexico, I'm sure even if we went into the Spanish congregation right there, there's going to be things that are slightly different, right? Or very different, yeah, right? If you go down, they might have the Lord's Supper a different time. There might be a ton of different things that are different, but that's okay, right? But for some people, that's not okay. The Pharisees, that was not okay. You need to be exactly like us.
Me, it's that, as we are children, we listen to the
Right.
And we grow and graduate and go to college, you listen to the teacher.
Right.
We are to listen to the teacher.
Right.
He is the
Absolutely.
one and only.
Right.
Right now, because he has the words that God gave him to teach us. And
Right.
God through him.
Right. Absolutely. That's exactly right. All right. So now they're going to do their next attack. So they're just kind of, just all they do is launch attacks. You know, it's kind of sad. None of them, they don't really come up to Jesus and they're like, hey, what can I do better? You know, they just come with these attacks and these tests, and they always are just looking for him to mess up. It's really difficult as you're reading to see that kind of mentality. But people have that mentality today too, especially when they look at God. But let's read verses 23 through 28. And it happened that he was passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath. And his disciples began to make their way along while picking the heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? And he said to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need and his companions became hungry? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priests. And he also gave it to those who were with him. And Jesus said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath. And I'll be honest, this is a difficult passage for me, because I think sometimes the takeaway from it, people can take too far, and some people don't take it far enough. Were they doing what was unlawful on the Sabbath? We'll start with that. Were they actually doing anything that was unlawful on the Sabbath?
Their law.
Yeah, right. Not according to God's law, but according to their law, right? Their own rules that they made up. There was nothing in the Old Testament that said you couldn't glean from this on the Sabbath or anything. There was nothing like that, and they weren't stealing. Deuteronomy 23, 24 through 25 talks about this, where if you're walking through, someone from Israel's vineyard, you could pick some grapes, and it wasn't stealing, as long as you didn't start putting them in a bag and take it. Or if you're walking through a grain field, you could take some, but you couldn't put it in a sickle or anything. You couldn't start taking it with you, right? This is just gleaning. It's totally okay under old law for them to be doing this. No one would have thought they were stealing. So they're not stealing. When we read this, we might be like, hey, that's not your grain field, because we don't walk into our neighbor's house and just take a little bit of stuff from the fridge. But for them, this is something God intended, right? And it was really intended for poor people to be able to do this, just to have something to be able to eat, which we don't think about this. Were Jesus and his disciples poor?
They were in the grain field is what, is what I'm trying to remember. They were in the grain field eating. And that was that really in the Sabbath? No, I mean, it was on the Sabbath, but the day of Sabbath is the day of preparation.
Right, the day of rest. Yeah, right. But yes, so right, they're going through the field and everything. But they are poor. Sorry, yeah, they are poor. Jesus said the foxes have holes, right? The birds have nests. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And he lived a very, very humble life, which seems weird to us because we're like, you can just make food appear whenever you want, right? But he didn't always do that, right? He wasn't just always walking through life, miracle, 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 here's a nice steak dinner. They were going through life with very, very humble circumstances, right? So they're doing all of these things. Even when you remember all the food they had on hand when Jesus fed the 5,000, it's like we got some loaves, we got like a little bit of fish. It's not a lot of food, right? Like this is what we could scrounge up. This is what we have. So they're not living this life of luxury that you would expect, from God in the flesh. He's living a very humble life. And they're just eating. Now, did everyone eat on the Sabbath? Yes. Nobody starved themselves on the Sabbath. Did God say you couldn't pick some food to eat on the Sabbath? No. But they had all of these man-made rules. And it's kind of interesting. If you go to Israel today, there are elevators that will stop at every floor and open up so that you don't have to press the button on the Sabbath. Because that's work for you to press the button. Depending on who you are and where you're at, these can be very, very strict rules. Is that what God had in mind when he said, hey, keep the Sabbath holy? It's a day of rest? No. And Jesus is going to point to that in a second. So they're not doing anything that's a violation of the law. But their claim was, that's unlawful. You're doing what's not lawful. What we would say is you're doing something that's not scriptural, right? They're saying you are sinning by doing this. The only thing that they were in violation of was the tradition of the Pharisees, not the law of Moses. So, given that they did not sin, given that they weren't violating the law, why didn't Jesus just say, I'm not violating the law? Because that's not his response. That's probably what I would have said. I would have been like, yeah, I'm not sinning. That's not what the law said. Right. Right. And I think this is why Jesus is so much smarter than us, as if we need that reminder. He's so much smarter, because I immediately would have been like, old law doesn't say I can't do that. I'm good. Jesus, yeah, right. Jesus uses this as a teaching moment to teach them a bigger picture about their whole issue with their understanding of the law anyways. He points back to David. If you guys remember the story of David, David went and ate the consecrated bread when he and his men were hungry. Now, Leviticus 24, 5 through 9, there's 12 loaves and 2 piles in there, the consecrated bread, and it was only for Levites. So David, not being a Levite, certainly should not lawfully be eating this food. It was unlawful for him to eat it. Unlike Jesus eating grain on the Sabbath, this was something that was specifically intended for Levites. He was not supposed to do it. And Jesus says, didn't you hear what David did when he was in need, how he ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful? So David went and did something that was unlawful in 1 Samuel 21, 1 through 6. They were in need of food. They were starving. They were on the run. So the priest gave them the holy bread. Did David sin when he did this? No. But he did what was not lawful. Is that a contradiction? Right, he lives in the old covenant. He's violating the law of Moses, which is from God. He's violating the law of God. But he didn't sin. Now you have to say, Jesus isn't saying he sinned, because if David did sin, what is Jesus' response here? They're saying he sinned, and he says, well, David sinned. Right? 2 wrongs make a right. David did it, I can do it. That's obviously not what Jesus is saying. But Jesus is trying to teach them that even though the law of God said something, they should have understood that in the moment what was more important was love for their neighbor. Hosea 6:6 says, for I desire mercy over sacrifice and knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. They were very, very focused on the specific letter and rule of the law. And sometimes rightfully so. You didn't want just everybody going into the temple eating consecrated bread all the time. That would have been disrespectful to God and all those things. But there was someone who was hungry and was in need, right? And they went in and ate, right? Before any other commandments, or I'll ask this before I ask that. Does that make you a little bit uncomfortable? Just Jesus' point here. It made me a little bit uncomfortable the first time I studied it, because I don't want to give the impression that Jesus is saying the law's not really that important. Did God mean it when he said, hey, only Levites are supposed to eat this bread? Yeah, God doesn't say stuff just to say it, right? Like, he meant it. But he expects us to understand in certain situations that love for a person, love for a neighbor, is more important than a specific law or regulation, right? In an extreme circumstance. Jesus summarizes this point in Matthew 22, 34 through 40, where he says this. But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, what is the greatest commandment of the law? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. So he says, love God and love your neighbor. And then he says, on these 2 commandments depend all the law and the prophets. Everything in the Old Covenant, everything in the Old Testament was built on those 2 principles, love God and love your neighbor. If they understand love for their neighbor and you see David is hungry, and his companions are starving, and you have bread, love for your neighbor would say, obviously God's law would not prevent me from giving them food when they're hungry, right? Even though it didn't specifically say unless somebody's hungry. They should have understood through love for their neighbor that that's what this is about. And then Jesus makes a broader point, that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. He created the Sabbath for people. He didn't create us for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was a reminder for them to rest. And it's really important. I think we forget this with the Sabbath. Deuteronomy 5:12 through 15 points out when he instituted this, he says, I brought you out of Egypt. And that's why he gives them the Sabbath. Is I brought you out of Egypt, and you guys will remember that. What did they do in Egypt? What was life like in Egypt? They were slaves. Did they get a day off every week? No. God's saying, remember what I did for you. Every time you take this day off where you don't work, and you don't have to do all these difficult things, this is because I freed you from Egypt. He's creating this for them to enjoy a rest that they didn't get before. So if you're taking a day that's created for you to have rest, and you're saying, no, you can't eat, that's not very good rest. Have you ever tried to rest when you're starving? And Jesus is saying, look, this is made for us to rest. We're eating, and you're saying you can't do this. I want you to imagine this. It's your birthday, right? Everybody's birthday is today. Surprise. Like, you can all go get cake afterwards. But I say, hey, it's your birthday. And we're going to have a birthday party, but I want you to get it ready. And I want you to decorate your house. And I want you to bake yourself a cake. And I want you to go buy yourself a bunch of presents. And I want you to wrap them. And I want you to sing yourself happy birthday. Does that sound like an appealing day? No, you're like, some party this is. I'm doing all the work, right? Like, this isn't really a celebration for me. This doesn't feel like it's for me. If they viewed the Sabbath, a day that was created for them, like Jesus says, as something of a burden, then they don't understand the gift that God is giving them. A gift is not a burden, right? The Sabbath being given to them was given as a good thing, a resting thing. And they took it as a burden. Oh, we can't do this on the Sabbath and we can't do this. That's not what God intended. God said, I gave you this great gift. Enjoy it, right? And remember that I'm the one that gave it to you. Remember what I've done for you. But they've created all of these extra rules and made things harder on themselves than it had to be. If the Sabbath prevented you from eating when you're hungry, it would not be a good gift, right? They'd be like, okay, thanks for this gift. It's like with friends like that, who needs enemies? Like, I don't want to go to don't come to my next birthday party if that's the kind of gifts you're going to give me. I remember one of my friends, somebody gave him a dog, and he was his wife was excited. They're a married couple, and she wanted a dog, and her mom went and got them a dog. And the husband was like, now I've got to take this dog out every morning, and I've got to walk it because she doesn't want to, and I've got to clean up its accidents and all that stuff. And he's like, I don't want gifts like this. Well, the Sabbath isn't a gift like that. It's not a gift that should be burdensome. It's not a gift that should be hard. But they didn't understand that. So Jesus' responses are, you misunderstand the law, and you misunderstand the Sabbath. And then the last point he makes is the Son of Man, Jesus, is Lord even of the Sabbath. What's his point there? If the first two reasons didn't help you out, your misunderstanding of the law because of David and the Sabbath being made for man, I'm in charge, by the way. It's like, just so you guys know, I'm also Lord of the Sabbath, which means master of the Sabbath. So I kind of get to decide. So it's like he gives two really, really good, logical issues with it. And he's like, also, I'm Lord of the Sabbath. I'm in charge. So any comments or questions on that, and we'll stop. All right. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.